Sarah Whitfield had 60 days to leave the only home her daughter had ever known, and $11,000 less than the bank needed to change its mind. 3 hours after the notice was nailed to her front porch, a man from an Atlanta law firm called her cell phone about a grandfather she thought had left her nothing but debt. The coffee was always scorched by 5 in the morning because Sarah made it too strong and forgot it on the burner while she pulled on her boots in the dark. It was a habit her grandfather, Walt, had teased her about for 30 years. And now that he was gone, the smell of burnt coffee was the closest thing to hearing his voice. She stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse in Sumter County, Georgia, watching the fog sit low over 300 acres of turned peanut ground. And for a moment, she let herself pretend nothing had changed. Then Emma's sneakers thudded down the stairs, 7 years old, and already late for the bus, and the pretending stopped. Sarah had been an emergency room nurse in Macon for 9 years before Emma's father left, and the commute stopped making sense. She'd moved back to her grandfather's farm 18 months ago, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself Walt needed the company more than she needed the quiet. He was 78 then, still climbing into the cab of his old tractor every morning like it was 1975. 4 months ago, she'd found him in the barn, sitting against a support post like he'd simply decided to rest there, his heart finally finished with the argument it had been having with him for years. He hadn't left a will anyone could find. He'd left a mortgage nobody knew he'd taken out, a stack of unopened bank letters in a kitchen drawer, and a silence where answers should have been. On the wall by the back door hung his old canvas work jacket, and on the kitchen table sat the one thing Sarah couldn't bring herself to move, a cracked leather ledger, its pages gone soft and brown at the edges, filled with Walt's cramped handwriting, planting dates, yields, debts paid, debts owed, notes to himself in a language of numbers she had never learned to read. She told herself she'd deal with it eventually. She told herself a lot of things eventually. Emma grabbed a granola bar and ran for the bus, and Sarah stood there a moment longer, staring at that ledger like it might finally decide to explain itself. It wouldn't be the last surprise the old man left behind. She just didn't know that yet. The letter had come on a Tuesday. Sarah had read it standing in the driveway, with the mail still bundled in her fist, the words Pacific AG Credit, notice of default sitting at the top of the page like a diagnosis. 60 days. $34,600 past due on a mortgage taken out 11 years earlier against land that had been in her family since 1961. She'd found the loan papers herself, buried in that kitchen drawer, about a month after the funeral, and had spent the 2 months since trying to piece together what they meant, while the missed payments quietly stacked up behind them. It was only now, with the notice nailed to the porch, that the bank had finally run out of patience and the 60-day clock had actually started ticking. She'd gone back inside and found Emma doing homework at the kitchen table, and she'd smiled and said everything was fine because that was what you did. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at the table with the ledger open in front of her and a legal pad covered in numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times she ran them. Walt had never been rich. He'd never claimed to be. He grew peanuts. He fixed his own equipment. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation for as long as she could remember. There was no explanation for a $340,000 loan against a farm that, by her estimate, might be worth $280,000 on a good day with a patient buyer. She'd called the bank's local branch twice that week. Both times, the woman on the phone had the same tired kindness of someone who delivers bad news for a living. The loan was real, the paperwork was signed, and the 60-day clock did not care that Sarah hadn't known any of this existed. She thought about calling her mother, who'd left Georgia decades ago and wanted nothing to do with the farm or its debts. She thought about calling a realtor and getting ahead of the foreclosure, selling before the bank could, at least keeping some small piece of what Walt had built. She was still turning that idea over 3 days later when she drove into town to meet with the county extension office about her planting rights. A woman behind the counter mentioned, almost in passing, that Walt used to drive up to Atlanta twice a year, regular as clockwork, for as long as anyone could remember, always the same week each spring, and again each fall, like he had a standing appointment he never missed. Sarah had never known that. Walt hated Atlanta. He complained about the traffic every time he was forced anywhere near it, and yet twice a year, without fail, he went anyway. She didn't think much of it until the following week, when a man named Daniel Rourke identified himself on her voicemail as an attorney with a firm on Peachtree Street, and asked her, in a voice that was careful in a way she didn't yet understand, to call him back at her earliest convenience regarding the estate of Walton Pierce. Sarah didn't call back that night. She sat on the porch steps instead, the ledger on her knees, the fireflies coming up out of the peanut rows the way they had every June of her childhood. And she let herself be afraid for exactly 10 minutes before she picked up the phone. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't understand for weeks, was that those quiet trips to Atlanta had nothing to do with the farm at all, and everything to do with a decision her grandfather made in 1987 that he had never told a single living soul. The days after that first call to Daniel Rourke moved strangely, the way time does when you're waiting on something you can't name. He was cordial on the phone, but wouldn't say much beyond the fact that Walt's estate involved an asset outside the farm property, and that it would be easier to discuss in person. Sarah didn't have the gas money for a spontaneous trip to Atlanta, not with the mortgage clock running, so she asked him to send whatever he could by mail, and then she went back to trying to solve a problem that had no solution she could see. The bank was not interested in patience. A loan officer named Curtis Hale, polite in the particular way of a man delivering news he'd delivered many times before, explained that Pacific Ag Credit could offer a short extension if Sarah could show proof of a pending asset or a serious buyer. But 60 days was already the generous version of the timeline. She asked him more than once how her grandfather, a man who paid cash for a used truck rather than carry a car payment, had ended up borrowing $340,000 against a farm that, by her own estimate, wasn't worth much more than $280,000. Curtis didn't have a full answer, but he turned the closing documents around on the desk and pointed to a line she'd skimmed past twice already. The loan was secured not just by the land, but by an additional undisclosed financial asset, listed without further detail. Neither of them knew what that meant. It would be weeks, with Rourke's letter finally in her hands, before Sarah understood that the extra collateral had been 600 shares in a peanut processing company, 2 counties over. The quiet reason a bank had ever agreed to lend against a farm the land alone could never have supported. She tried the neighbors next. Ruth Calloway, who'd farmed the land next to Walt's for 40 years and knew him better than most family, said only that Walt had gone through a hard stretch in the late 80s, after a bad drought took 2 seasons of crops and nearly the whole operation with it. He never talked about it, Ruth said, standing in her kitchen doorway with flour on her hands. A man like that, he'd rather lose a finger than admit he needed help. She paused like she was deciding whether to say more, and then added that there had been a rumor, decades old and half forgotten, that Walt had struck some kind of deal to keep the farm afloat back then. Nobody had ever known the details. Nobody had thought to ask, because the farm survived, Walt kept farming, and life moved on the way it does. Sarah drove home with that rumor sitting in her chest like a held breath. That night, she went through the ledger page by page for the first time with real attention, no longer treating it as a keepsake, but as a record. Most of it was exactly what she expected: yields, weather notes, equipment repairs. But tucked into the entries from 1987 in ink that looked different from the surrounding pages, darker, more deliberate, was a single line that stopped her cold. CPPC, 600 shares, never sell. She had no idea what CPPC stood for. She typed it into her phone before she'd even finished reading the line twice. The search turned up almost nothing useful, just a defunct-looking website for something called Colquitt Peanut Processing Company, a regional sheller and processor 2 counties over, that Sarah vaguely remembered her grandfather delivering to, back when she was young enough to ride in the truck bed against the rules. She called the number listed. It rang 11 times before someone picked up, a woman who sounded surprised anyone still had that number and who told her, in a tone suggesting this wasn't the first time she'd fielded a confused call like this, that questions about shareholder records needed to go through their office manager. And that office manager wouldn't be in until Monday. While she waited, Sarah drove out to see Ruth again, this time with a photograph she'd found tucked between the ledger's back pages. Walt, younger than Sarah had ever known him, standing outside a brick building she didn't recognize, shaking hands with a man in a suit. Ruth studied it for a long moment before she placed it. That's the old processing plant, before they rebuilt the front of it, she said. I remember that summer. Half the county farmers were meeting out there in secret about something, small groups at a time so nobody in town would notice. The talking, the deciding, all of that happened right there at the plant. It was only the very last part, signing whatever papers made it official, that had them driving up to some lawyer's office in Atlanta. She couldn't remember what the meetings had been about, only that Walt had come back from that stretch different, quieter, she said. Like a man who'd made a decision he wasn't proud enough of to talk about, even though it had likely saved everything he owned. Sarah didn't sleep much that weekend. She kept doing the math on 600 shares of a company she knew nothing about, kept telling herself not to hope for anything, and kept hoping anyway. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed from a cracked leather ledger and a mysterious set of initials, was that Colquitt Peanut Processing Company had, in the years since her grandfather bought in, grown from a struggling regional operation into a supplier for 3 national grocery chains, and that never sell hadn't been sentiment. It had been strategy. Daniel Rourke's envelope arrived the following Wednesday, and Sarah opened it standing in the driveway again, the same place she'd opened the foreclosure notice weeks before, as if the mailbox itself had become the site of every turn in her life now. Inside was a letter far more formal than anything Curtis Hale at the bank had ever sent her, explaining that Walton Pierce had been a minority shareholder in Colquitt Peanut Processing Company since March of 1987, holding 600 shares acquired during a recapitalization when the company nearly folded during the drought years. The letter didn't give her a number. It gave her a meeting date in Atlanta the following Thursday to discuss valuation and next steps. She called Rourke's office 3 times trying to get him to just tell her what the shares were worth over the phone. Each time, his assistant was kind but firm. Mr. Rourke preferred to walk clients through the full picture in person, particularly given the complexity of this particular estate. Sarah didn't have it in her to be angry. She was too busy running numbers in her head, imagining every possibility from nothing at all to enough to save the farm outright, and neither felt entirely real. She found someone to watch Emma and made the 2-hour drive to Atlanta on a Thursday morning with the ledger on the passenger seat beside her. like bringing Walt along for the answer he'd never gotten around to giving her himself. Rourke's office was on the 11th floor of a glass building that made her farm boots feel very loud in the hallway. He was younger than she expected, maybe 40, with the kind of gentleness that told her he'd delivered both good and bad news, enough times to know how to sit with either. The 600 shares, he told her, were currently valued at roughly $350 apiece, based on the company's last internal valuation and recent acquisition interest from a larger regional distributor. Sarah did the math before he finished the sentence. $210,000. Enough, more than enough, to clear the default and bring the mortgage current, with room left to breathe for the first time in months. She didn't cry in the meeting, though she came close. What stopped her wasn't relief. It was the next thing Rourke said, delivered carefully, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis wrapped in a treatment plan. The shares weren't liquid the way a stock on an exchange would be. Company bylaws, unchanged since 1987, required any shareholder holding above 5%, which Walt's stake, unusually large for a minority holder, technically was, to either sell to existing shareholders at a below-market internal price or step into an active advisory role on the board for a minimum of 2 years before an outside sale could even be considered. Walt, it turned out, had never sold because he'd never wanted the below-market price and had simply let the shares sit, present on paper but never active in practice. Those twice-yearly trips to Atlanta, Rourke explained, had never been about running the company. They were the required spring and fall shareholder meetings where Walt showed up as the bylaws obligated him to, voted in block with whatever the majority wanted without ever raising an objection, collected the dividend statement the company still insisted on handing founding shareholders in person, and drove home the same day. He'd never missed one in 37 years. He'd also never once used his voice in the room. There was no clean, fast $210,000 waiting to drop into her account and solve everything. Rourke walked her through the bylaws page by page, and the more he explained, the more Sarah understood why her grandfather had never talked about any of it. The recapitalization in 1987 had been born out of desperation, not opportunity. Colquitt Peanut Processing had been 3 months from shutting its doors when a handful of local farmers, Walt among them, agreed to buy in at a steep discount in exchange for propping the company up with cash it needed to survive the drought years. In return, the founding family who'd controlled the company had written protections into the bylaws that made it nearly impossible for any of those original minority holders or their heirs to simply cash out and walk away. It wasn't malicious. It was designed, Rourke explained, to keep the company from being picked apart by shareholders looking for a quick payday the moment things got better. Walt had signed those terms without complaint, the same way he signed for everything else in his life, and had simply never mentioned it again. There was a choice. The internal price isn't negotiable, Rourke told her. It's set by a fixed formula written into the 1987 bylaws. 60% of the most recent valuation, adjusted for the size of the stake. For your grandfather's shares, that comes out to somewhere around $140,000. She could sell to the existing shareholders now at that fixed price. Enough to stop the foreclosure, but not enough to leave much cushion. And it would mean walking away from something her grandfather had held onto for 37 years without ever cashing in. Or she could do the thing that made her stomach drop just thinking about it. Step into the board seat herself, learn a business she knew nothing about, commit 2 years to a company 2 counties away, and access the full value only after that commitment was honored. Before she left the office, Rourke mentioned one more detail, almost as an afterthought, that stayed with Sarah the entire drive home. The founding family that had written those protective bylaws back in 1987 had, over the decades, sold off nearly all of their own shares to outside investors chasing quick returns. Exactly the kind of shareholders the bylaws had been designed to guard against. Walt was one of only 2 original minority holders left on the books. In 37 years, he had never once tried to get around the rules, never hired a lawyer to fight the terms, never complained. He had simply kept farming, kept his notes, and waited for a moment he apparently believed somewhere down the line, someone in his family would be ready to use. Sarah drove home with 60 days shrinking toward 41, no clear answer, and her grandfather's ledger sitting on the passenger seat like it was waiting for her to finally understand what it had been trying to tell her the whole time. The board seat made no sense on paper. Sarah had spent her adult life reading vital signs, not balance sheets. She didn't know the first thing about food processing, commodity pricing, or the difference between a shelling contract and a supply agreement. And the idea of sitting in a boardroom across from men who'd run agribusinesses for decades felt less like an opportunity and more like a trap door waiting to open under her. But the numbers from the quick sale kept coming up short. She sat with Curtis Hale at the bank and walked through it plainly. $140,000 would clear the default and buy her breathing room, but it wouldn't touch the equipment loan Walt had also apparently taken out. Wouldn't cover 2 years of property taxes she now understood she'd been underestimating. Wouldn't leave anything for the roof that had been failing since the spring storms. The full value of the shares, held through the 2-year commitment, wouldn't just save the farm. It would actually put it on solid ground for the first time since before Sarah was born. She called Daniel Rourke back on a Sunday night after Emma was asleep and told him she wanted to explore the board seat. The first meeting, 3 weeks later, was the hardest thing she'd done since the night she found Walt in the barn. Colquitt Peanut. Processing's boardroom sat 6 men and 1 woman around a table stacked with reports full of language Sarah didn't understand. And the company's president, a clipped, efficient man named Robert Aldous, made no effort to hide his skepticism about a farmer's granddaughter with an ER nursing background inheriting decision-making power over supply contracts and capital expenditures. He wasn't cruel about it. He was simply direct, in the way of a man who believed competence needed to be proven rather than assumed. And Sarah left that first meeting in her truck in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake, choosing pride over a fast, simple $140,000. She almost called Rourke the next morning to reverse the decision. She got as far as dialing the number before she hung up. What kept her from finishing that call wasn't stubbornness, though there was plenty of that in her, too. It was the ledger. She'd started actually reading it by then, really reading it, cross-referencing Walt's cramped entries against the company reports Rourke had sent, and she was starting to see something nobody else seemed to have noticed. Her grandfather hadn't just been a passive shareholder collecting dividends. He'd been tracking the company's yields, its shelling capacity, its contract terms for decades, in the same obsessive detail he tracked his own farm. There were notes in the margins that read like a man quietly diagnosing a business he cared about, but never had the standing or the confidence to speak up in. Sarah began to understand that her grandfather hadn't failed to use his shareholder position. He'd simply never believed anyone would listen to a peanut farmer telling a processing company how to run itself. She decided she would be the one who spoke up. She started small, the way you learn to trust your footing on unfamiliar ground. Before her second board meeting, she drove to the Colquitt facility itself, a low brick building that smelled of roasted shells and diesel, and asked the plant manager, a weathered man named Ellis, who'd worked the shelling lines for 26 years, if he'd walk her through the process from truck to storage silo. He seemed surprised anyone from the board had ever asked. He gave her 2 full hours, and by the end of it, Sarah understood more about moisture, content, and grading standards than she had from a month of reading financial reports. She started doing this before every meeting after that, quietly, without announcing it, learning the business from the ground floor instead of trying to absorb it from a conference room table. Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into learning a business she had no formal right to understand. She spent her nights after Emma went to bed reading agricultural economics articles instead of sleeping, taught herself to read a balance sheet from a library book she renewed 4 times, and called a cousin who worked in commodities, trading in Savannah, with questions that embarrassed her to ask, but that she asked anyway. She made mistakes in board meetings that made her face burn, misreading a hedging strategy, mispronouncing a term everyone else took for granted. And twice she drove the 2 hours home in silence, replaying every moment she'd sounded like she didn't belong in that room. There was a night, about 4 months in, when she nearly quit for good. The company was considering a shelling equipment upgrade that would require every shareholder to approve a temporary dividend freeze, and Sarah trying to advocate for a smaller, more conservative version of the upgrade based on what she'd learned from Walt's old yield notes, was overruled 6-1 in a vote that felt less like disagreement and more like dismissal. She sat in her truck afterward and cried the way she hadn't let herself cry since the funeral, not for the vote, but for the exhausting, grinding doubt that she was simply out of her depth, playing at a role that belonged to people with degrees and decades she didn't have. She thought about the farm, about Emma, about how much simpler everything would have been if she'd just taken the $140,000 and walked away. She almost called Rourke again that night. Instead, she went home, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the ledger to the last entries Walt had written before he died. Nothing about the farm at all, just a single line dated 6 weeks before his death that read, "Told them the moisture readings were off on the east silo. They didn't listen. He told them anyway." Sarah sat with that line for a long time. She realized, sitting there, that her grandfather had spent 37 years being right in the margins of a ledger nobody read, too afraid or too proud to say it out loud where it counted. She understood in a way that settled something in her chest that she wasn't in that boardroom to prove she belonged there. She was there to say the things he never had. The company adopted her scaled-down equipment proposal 8 months into her term, after a smaller shelling operator 2 counties over went bankrupt, trying the aggressive upgrade Colquitt had originally been leaning toward, and Sarah's version came in 20% under budget, with capacity gains almost identical to the larger plan. Robert Aldous didn't apologize exactly, but he started asking her opinion before board votes instead of after. And by her second year, the other shareholders had stopped introducing her as Walton's granddaughter and started simply calling her Sarah. The farm survived on the strength of that first 18 months more than anyone, including Sarah, expected. The dividend income, modest at first but steadily climbing as the company stabilized under decisions she'd helped shape, cleared the mortgage default within the first year and chipped away at the equipment loan through the second. She didn't sell the shares when her 2-year commitment ended. She'd started, without entirely meaning to, actually loving the work. The strange, unexpected discovery that the same instincts that made her good in an emergency room, staying calm under pressure, reading a room quickly, refusing to let panic make decisions for her, made her good in a boardroom too. The farm changed too, though not the way she'd once imagined saving it would look. She stopped trying to run it exactly as Walt had, 300 acres of peanuts and nothing else, and instead scale the planted acreage down, leasing part of the land to a neighbor for row crops, while keeping a smaller, well-managed peanut operation that fed directly into Colquitt's supply chain at a preferred rate her board position had earned honestly, not through favoritism, but through the kind of trust that gets built one good decision at a time. The farm stopped being the whole of her income and her identity. It became instead a piece of a life that had grown larger than she'd known it could. On the second anniversary of Walt's death, Sarah sat at the same kitchen table where she'd once stared at a foreclosure notice with no idea what to do next. The ledger sat open in front of her, not as a mystery anymore, but as a working tool. She kept her own entries in it now, continuing the record in the empty pages after his, planting notes beside boardroom notes, her handwriting slowly filling the space his had left behind. Emma, 9 now, sat across from her doing homework, occasionally glancing up to ask what a word in the old pages meant, and Sarah found herself, more often than not, able to answer. She still made the coffee too strong most mornings. She still burned it sometimes, lost in thought at the window while the fog sat low over the fields, the way it always had. But when she caught the smell now, it didn't just remind her of what she'd lost. It reminded her of the ledger, of the boardroom, of a quiet, stubborn old man who'd spent decades being right in the margins and never once said it out loud, and of the granddaughter who finally learned to say it for him. The farm hadn't made her rich. What it gave her was harder to put a number on, and worth more than any dividend check ever could be. Proof that she could stand in a room full of people who doubted her, and stay anyway, and be right anyway, and come home to the people who mattered, still standing on solid ground. That spring, Colquitt's board approved a small mentorship program for local growers. Sarah's proposal, built around exactly what Ellis had once given her for free on a slow Tuesday afternoon. 2 hours, a walk through the plant, someone willing to explain how the pieces fit together. She named it, without asking anyone's permission, after the line she'd found in the ledger the night she'd almost quit. She never explained the name to the rest of the board, and none of them ever asked. Some things she'd learned from Walt didn't need to be said out loud to be understood by the person they were meant for. On the drive home from the plant that evening, Emma asleep in the back seat with a Colquitt grower's cap pulled low over her eyes, Sarah passed the old weathered sign at the edge of the property, Pierce Farm, Est, 1961, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel the small tightening in her chest that used to come with reading it. The farm was smaller now, leaner, folded into something bigger than it had ever been on its own, but it was still standing. And so, finally, was she.